Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 28 of The Conscious Capitalists with your co-hosts, myself, Timothy Henry, and my partner in making the world a better place through business, Raj Sisodia. Hi, Raj.
Hi, Timothy. Great to be with you again.
Yeah, good to see you. Favorite time of the week when we have a chance to get together with our guests. And we have a very special guest today. And do you want to introduce him, Raj, or should I?
Well, Danny Friedland is a well-known physician who has pivoted away from traditional medicine and has really become a world-leading authority on leadership, on conscious leadership, on holistic well-being, and has written a very influential book on that and has, I think, made thousands of presentations and given talks and has been a regular at our Conscious Capitalism CEO Summits for a number of years now, where he has given keynotes as well as workshops. So he is really a person who has influenced a lot of leaders as a high-level coach, as well as somebody who's helped them develop into more conscious leaders. And he's going through a very interesting phase of his life that he's going to share with us today.
Hello, Danny. Welcome to our show.
Well, I just want to begin with incredible gratitude for both of you. It's such a joy. And the impact that you've had on my life cannot be overstated. And for my community, I would love to introduce you to Raj and Timothy. And this is the seminal book on conscious capitalism, written by John Mackey and Raj Sisodia. And this book was followed by that book, which is Conscious Capitalism Field Guide, authored by Raj, Timothy, and Thomas Eckschmidt. And these have been life-changing books for me. They've opened my world to the possibility of what conscious capitalism can realize in the world. And Raj, you had written a book before that, Firms of Endearment. And the data was fascinating because what you shared in that, I believe you followed 28 companies over a 15-year period, and the current data shows that these companies outperform, the market by a factor of about 10 to 1. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it was 9 to 1 over 10 years in the original set of companies.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
So I became fascinated. by that. And I wanted to really understand the neuroscience, what underpins that. And so that led me to write this book, Leading Well from Within, which is a neuroscience and mindfulness-based framework for conscious leadership. And so this work I fed into your stream to unpack the operating system around it. And it's been just I am so appreciative for your leadership, for your conscious leadership. Beyond that, I believe we were in the Conscious Leaders Learning Lab together. We had a very intimate experience in Austin together.
Mm-hmm.
And I am just most deeply touched by your humanity, how you truly embody conscious leadership. There's an intangible, there are practices with this, but there is an embodiment of it too. So I am so in awe of both of you.
Thank you, Daddy. It's very kind.
That's a beautiful way to start. And, I think that playing off that embodiment, in a way that you've sort of taken neuroscience and mindfulness and sort of said, like for a conscious leader, what does that mean in order to help them become their best selves as leaders? And I think that's where your book starts the launch pad to another level of discussion about conscious leadership. So I'd love you to maybe say a little bit about that idea of like, how do neuroscience and mindfulness come together, especially with your background as being one of the early practitioners of evidence-based medicine? to end up in this place where you're sort of saying, let me take the neuroscience, let me take the mindfulness and bring it together in a meaningful, practical way around what that means for a leader. That's a...
Well, so I'll start like at a very high level. The simplicity of this is, I titled the book Leading Well from Within, because before we can lead well in the world, the first place we have to be able to lead is within ourselves. So it begins within, and this awakening of conscious leadership, it's an act of influence. It's the capacity to have influence. So we first have to have influence. We need to understand, how do we navigate stress, uncertainty, and self-doubt, because that grips us in the state of reactivity. And how do we allow ourselves to elevate ourselves to our best version of ourselves so that we can then elevate others? Because you can't, if you're standing on your own neck, it's very hard to serve others.
Yeah.
But if you can become kind and loving to yourself, and you have a mindful awareness to elevate yourself, you now have the capacity to elevate others.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is that essentially the brain maps to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There's a construct of the brain called the triune brain. And so the triune brain means it's an evolutionary model of the brain where the brain develops from the bottom up and the back forward. It's an evolutionary model of the brain developed by Paul MacLean from at the National Institute of Mental Health in the 1960s. And so ultimately, the first part of the triune brain is focused on safety and survival primarily. These are the strongest circuits in the brain. So our brain's first primer is we're safety first. And next level up, as we actually explore safety, comes to, so the first part of the triune brain is the reptilian brain. Middle part of the brain, the second part of the triune brain, is called the Paleo Mammalian brain. And that has a number of functions, one of which is pair bonding. So this gives rise to the seat of love and belonging, which is more broadly distributed in the brain. It's a conceptual model. And then you've got the seat of conscious awareness, the third part of the triune brain, which is the seat of higher consciousness, is the neocortex. And part of the neocortex is the prefrontal cortex, which is, if you were to designate the CEO of your brain, you would want this part of the brain to drive, because it has a number of factors that map into high performance conscious leadership. The triune brain maps into a simplified version of Maslow's hierarchy of need with a pyramid of safety, love and belonging, and significance. And here's the kicker. There are two main factors that will determine whether or not you plummet, you cave into reactivity, or you're able to rise to the challenge. And the formula is, what are the demands and resources in your life? So when demands exceed resources, we go into a threat response, particularly around stress and self-doubt, and we go into a state of reactivity. We go into our fight and flight responses. And Raj, I've seen you speak so eloquently about this, just in terms of, the pain and suffering that people go through, and then their ego takes over. And so some of which is this stream of reactivity is partly adaptive, because particularly in areas of physical danger. So we're hypervigilant for COVID contagion right now. But when it comes to relationships, to psychological threats of stress and self-doubt, here's where we fight for control, or we take flight from things that leave us feeling out of control. Here's where we fight to prove self-worth, or we take flight from anything that triggers self-doubt. And that puts in a tremendous strain on relationships. Tremendous strain on relationships. So when demands exceed resources, we cave under threat. And now we're in a time of COVID. So in a time of, a great awakening of systemic racism. So there are disproportionate demands on, our brothers and sisters. So when we spend weeks or months in the stream of reactivity, like we are now, we've been in COVID a long time. Ultimately, what happens is we plummet into the safety frame and we feel exhausted. We actually forego love and belonging. We become disconnected. We forego what gives us a sense of significance, and we have a reduced sense of accomplishment. Those three factors are the classic factors of burnout. That's Maslow's burnout inventory. So the inverse of the simplified version of Maslow's hierarchy of need is burnout. And I only mention that as an act of self-compassion to give yourself. So if you're feeling burnt out, just know this is your brain normal function under these situations of high demand and low resources to protect yourself from harm. This is how your brain is designed to react. So, experiencing compassionate latitude. Now, Peter Drucker has a very funny quote with speaking about the powerful gravitational pull of this. He says, all organizations are a mix of friction, confusion, and low performance. Speaking to the gravitational pull into reactivity. He says, everything else requires leadership. Everything else requires leadership. And so awakened conscious leaders are leaders that have skills and practices that can elevate themselves, not when times are easy, but they make their mark in times of challenge, and they're able to tap into more deeply into their internal resources to elevate themselves and others. So they're finding the resources to exceed the demands, tapping in to create a deeper sense of psychological safety within themselves and others, to reconnect people with themselves and others, and then to rediscover the joy and purpose in their life. And that's the work of awakened conscious leadership, the skills and practices of that. So high performance conscious leadership, the prefrontal cortex, has a number of capacities that put you in a state of awakened conscious leadership. So the capacities are emotional composure. So there are fibers from the prefrontal cortex that help you pause before you react. There is a highway of fibers that come up from the insula that radiate forward into the prefrontal cortex that give you the capacity for social awareness, empathy, compassion. These are the circuits of decision-making. So judgment, planning, abstraction. And then these are the circuits of mindful awareness, metacognition, where you can step back and say, "Boy, there goes a damn crazy thought. Perhaps I won't act on that one right now." So it's the neuroscience of this is compelling. And we oscillate between these states of reactivity and creativity naturally. We'll either plummet under threat or we'll be able to rise to the challenge. This is a highly dynamic state. So even awakened conscious leaders, there are times of the day where your demands exceed your resources and you'll go into a state of reactivity. It's very, the mark of evolution, transformation, is not the absence of reactivity, but it's how quickly can you pivot? How quickly can you pivot?
Well, that is such a key point, Danny. I mean, I just want to pause there. That ability to pivot. I think in your book, you use the phrase sometimes, we go limbic. That
Yes.
ability to sort of say to myself, okay, hold on, folks, I'm having a limbic moment, say it inside myself, but also to share it with my team. I'm going
Yeah.
limbic. Okay, I'm in my reactive mode. And
Yeah.
then that ability to sort of say, given that, how do I shift? And so I think that that's where there's incredible value in, the practical way that you start to say, hey, how do I go from that state of reactivity and build into this, build practices or habits that help me recognize and move beyond that.
So I love the implication of where you're going with this question. How do we shift? And so to thread back into leadership's an act of influence. And that's not enough, actually. When you talk about conscious leadership, it actually needs to be influence, because Hitler was a very influential leader. So it needs to be influence as tethered to noble purpose. So conscious leadership is an act of influence tethered to noble purpose. And when we're in a state of reactivity, we're not only reactive within ourselves, because our brain is wired to connect. We're in relationship. The wiring is, the cycle of reactivity is fight, flight, trigger, fight, flight, trigger, fight, flight, trigger. That's the cycle of reactivity. So if somebody comes to you edgy, we're going to escalate. We're going to be triggered by that. We're going to go back. That's been the last 4 years of our administration. It's been an
little escalation issue there. Yeah.
Yes. So as opposed to, what is the cycle of creativity? And the cycle of creativity is a cycle of being able to essentially receive and give love with another. Receive others with empathy and understanding, and give with authenticity and care. And when you bring up the simplified version of Maslow in the sense, when we're in fight, flight, trigger, we're driving ourselves and others down into burnout and exhaustion. And I think Raj, what your data reveals is that ultimately, when we're in a cycle of receiving and giving love, as embodied by your beautiful, glorious work, Forms of Endearment, it's just such a beautiful expression. We cultivate naturally a foundation of psychological safety. We engage, we claim the love and belonging frame from which we can pivot into a state of purpose and significance. And that's what I believe the data shows. The underpinning, the neuroscience underpinning of the data, the compelling data. And so it's weaving the research about what works with an understanding of why it works is compelling.
So we build on that idea. We build on that idea in the healing organization, right, Danny? That it's not just about caring, but it's actually about actively healing. Yes. Suffering that does exist, and the role of the leader becomes even more critical there. Yes. The leader kind of sets the tone. If the leader is operating in that zone, then others will tend to operate in that zone as well. If the leader goes down into those lower areas and becomes reactive, and if the leader really hasn't worked on their own healing, carrying around traumas, and they're triggered, they get amygdala hijacked, all the time. That's going to show up. Everything gets amplified into the organization. It's like a huge magnifying glass, right? The company is essentially magnifying what's in the leader.
Yeah, I'm so happy, Raj, that you mentioned, because the state of healing overlap with this journey of claiming psychological safety, love and belonging, and significance. The prefrontal cortex has an integrator function. It integrates all levels below it. I often ask my healthcare audiences, what is the root of the word health? What is the root of the word health? And less than 5% of the audience knows, and we're in the healing profession. So the root of the word health comes from Old English, hail. Old English hail. The root of the word health is wholeness. the root of the word patience, the patience we are, comes from the word patiens, the Latin word patiens, which means to suffer. So we suffer from fragmentation of mind, body, and spirit, particularly under dis-ease, stress, mental friction. We suffer. And the role of the healer, when you talk about a leader, because leadership's an act of influence, any leader can become a healer. They can heal the organization. The role of the healer is to address the fragmentation. And in doing so, experience their sense of wholeness, their capacity to rise, and to basically bring integration into the organization by creating psychological safety, love and belonging, and reconnect people with the joy and purpose and significance of their work, to re-engage them in that. So ultimately, the role of the healer is to remind people of the essential wholeness they already are.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful, Danny. And I think that it's really interesting you bring up that word psychological safety, because it's getting so much play these days in terms of the importance of that inside a business.
Yeah.
But I like the way you've layered it, you know, that it's psychological safety is sort of the base stakes. And then after that comes this idea of caring, that then I need to feel like I'm in a caring environment. I'm not just in a psychologically safe one, I'm in a caring environment. And then I'm looking for meaning.
Yes.
So if you can help me, if a leader can help create an environment in which people feel safe, they feel cared for, and they feel that their work has meaning, there's something very fundamentally human about that. And I love the way you've tied it back to the science to say, not only is it something that we intuitively feel is human, but there's also some science behind it that says, you know, this is how we create optimal brain states that help us be at our best.
Yeah.
And so I love that. I really love that bringing that together like that.
So Danny, you know, a few months ago, you received a diagnosis, and now you're in a different phase of your life, and you're charting a course that I think very few people have done before in terms of how you are dealing with that and how you are using your own experience to teach and to extract wisdom, loving wisdom from, and really to document that at every stage. To leave a legacy, and we're all, of course, hoping and expecting and praying that you will get through this and you know, and recover fully. But I'd like you to share what you know, how you have dealt with this initially, what caused you to frame it in the way that you have, and how that experience has been for you, and the reaction. There's some of the reactions that you're getting.
Well, my life transformed dramatically on November 12th. I was actually on a coaching call, and for the first time, I couldn't finish my coaching call. I had word block, and my client said, "Do you think you need to be seen?" And I said, "I think I do." And I went into the emergency room. And this was November 12th, 2020.
So not being able to find a word, that was enough to get to an emergency room?
Yeah, well, I was embarrassed. It was that incapacitating that I couldn't get my words out. And so, you know, and I speak for a living and I serve with my words for a living. So all of a sudden there was a jar. It wasn't like I couldn't find a word. I couldn't get any of the words out. So I needed to be seen. And long story short, I went into the ER and I got an MRI, and got the diagnosis that I had grade 4 glioblastoma, so-called terminal brain cancer. And I am intent on not to be terminal. But at this point in diagnosis, theoretically, I should have 15 months to live. And when you walk through that doorway, your brain goes into survival mode. And you don't only walk through that doorway alone. When I told my family, you can imagine they were shocked. They were crushed. So that morning, I was on one side of a doorway with infinite possibility, infinite life. By that evening, I was now walked through the doorway of cancer, and I walked through the doorway with my family. But then we're in the time of COVID. So I was a bit to the wards alone. And I have a mindfulness practice, and I was noticing my thoughts. And many of my thoughts were, you can imagine, spikes of fear. Like, what's going to become? What now? What with my family? What you go into all of these kind of like what if and all the catastrophes that could happen. And then because I've got also this, the foundation of appreciative inquiry. I've learned this in the exchange community. I miraculously found a generative question. And David Cooper Ryder, who I understand you're dear friends with, has this statement that questions create worlds. Questions create worlds. And it's the difference, the default questions that our brain goes into survival mode because it's designed to protect itself from harm, puts us into a world of suffering. The key is, can you find a generative question that can put you in a world of flourishing? And because I've been primed for that, I found a generative question that was sufficient enough altitude. Questions have altitude as well. That put me into a state of where I could ask a generative question at altitude that led to answers, that led to more questions, that led to the touchdown with something pragmatic. And the question I asked, the generative question I found, is not what now, but what matters most now. What matters most now? It was the question. It's the question. The first tenet of conscious capitalism actually is purpose. It's a purpose question. What matters most now? And when time is running short, there's only one answer that tends to make sense. And it's the answer, make every moment count. Make every moment count. And then that put me into I asked the next simple question, which is how? How do I do this? And it led me into two streams of answers. The first was a stream of make every moment count in living into intensely loving relationships, into living those cycles of receiving and giving love. So I have, ever since I've lived the nourishment of making every moment. This is a moment that counts between us. We're in a cycle of receiving and giving love here with each other. I'm intent on making this moment count. In addition to you, with everybody listening, I hope you can feel my heart. And now I understood I'm going through a spiritual awakening. I mean, I'm going through an awakening. I used to think that conscious leadership was the awakening, and it's more of a mindfulness frame, and I'm aware, but now I understand that there's a second dimension to this awakening. There's actually 3 dimensions that I've experienced, but I understand now that the power of conscious leadership is when it's connected to an awakened heart. The power of conscious leadership is when it's connected to an awakened heart. That's the second dimension of this. And then the second stream of answers that came was my strong desire to leave a legacy with my work. Mm-hmm. And that is where we have created this YouTube channel called Living Well From Within. And it is, so if you Google search, if you Google search Living Well From Within YouTube, we have created a playlist for this. And the playlist captures my journey from day one. We now have 162 videos in the playlist. It's designed to be watched like binge watch it like a Netflix series. Mm-hmm. And the key over here is there are multiple arcs of the story. And the overarching arc is transforming challenge into healing, growth, and wellness. So it overlaps significantly with the work that you're doing with the healing organization, Raj. And there are so many plot lines that are weaving together here. The key over here is it's in our family's voice. I didn't want to actually kind of do this alone. I wanted to bring my family, they've walked through the doorway with me, to watch my wife and kids go through their transformation. I have never been this contented. I've never been this integrated. I am flourishing. I'm flourishing at this. I've got sunflowers behind me over here. So it begins with 2 videos for context. The start here video number 1 is our wish for you. Turn your greatest challenge into healing, growth, and flourishing wellness. So it is, our challenge is cancer, but we appreciate our challenge is no more important than the challenges everybody else is having right now. Everybody's got challenge. So we want to share the lessons that we're learning from our family to yours to facilitate transformation through engaging us all in a healing journey together. So that's what is most inspiring to me in this offering. And then there's the mechanism of how do you do that to facilitate transformation. So the second video over here speaks to this active learning cycle. There's a concept of an active learning cycle, and the active learning cycle has 3 components to it. The first component, and this is based on the work of Kolb on experiential learning. The first component is content or experience. But content or experience alone is not enough to create transformational change. And the evidence is that history repeats itself. So the next component is key because this is the component of reflection. It's the metabolism of the experience or the content that creates transformational change. High quality reflection that leads to inspiring action that comes back to a new experience. And this is not a closed loop. On its side, the upward spiral of growth and learning is experience, reflection, action, experience, reflection, action. It's a spiral, which I am mindful is the spiral of the cover of Conscious Capitalism and the field guide. So what we've done is in each one of these videos, we have built in active learning cycles to facilitate transformational change. So on this first video here, if you go to the video descriptions, here is where I go through the distilled experience in the video, and then I inspire reflection and action. So day 1, November 13th, my journey begins here when I'm describing the content or experience in the video. I have just received the results of my MRI. My most likely diagnosis is a high-grade glioblastoma brain cancer. Just before my brain biopsy, to confirm, my wife Sue asked me to record a message for our boys just in case anything happened during the biopsy. And the message I recorded for them, I said, the greatest wish I have for them in their life is for them to live a loving life. And that unpacks so much. So now I want to inspire reflection for you. And the reflection, you know, I'm inviting. These aren't prescriptive. These are just, these are offerings. So the questions are, if you received a life-threatening diagnosis, who would you reach out to? What message would you share with them? And the big question, why wait?
Why
wait?
Why wait?
Why wait?
I mean, why wait? What a beautiful way of putting it. Yeah.
And then what, the key of here, what action will you take right now to share what matters most with your loved ones?
Wow.
So that's, every one of these videos is designed to spark that type of transformational change. And I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. And if you feel inspired by what you're seeing, to share with others, you know, with a call to action for them to subscribe to.
Yeah, it's been amazing watching this journey, because I've been watching, like you say, binge watching, you know, like every 2 weeks I'll sit there and I'll catch up on the last 4 or 5 or 6 that are there.
Yeah.
And it's been incredibly powerfully moving, you know, to see your family's reaction. I remember when you got your hair shaved and your son came up and gave you a hug. And within that hug, there was so much pain on his part. There was so much sadness, and there was so much love, like all wrapped in together. And it was just amazing to be able to be honored to witness that.
Well, I want to share with you, I want to go back here and share with you some magic that's happened. Day 13. And, you know, we've had in Conscious Capitalism a senior leadership network that's been gathering and masterminding. And many of the discussions have been around kids that have been in COVID and having a difficult time with social isolation. So I had proposed to Alexander McCoben, who's the CEO of Conscious Capitalism, who have been blessed to be co-coaching with Heath Dickett for a number of years in his conscious leadership. Before my diagnosis, I was going to pitch that this is time for the founding of the teen chapter of Conscious Capitalism. And I had a sense, I'm imagining, but I had a sense that there's a lot going on, and Alexander may have said, perhaps this is not the time for it. Maybe he would have agreed. I don't, but he was in such a heart space. His heart was open when I shared, and the power of evoked compassion. When people learn that I have terminal brain cancer, there's a natural outpouring of compassion. But here's what I love about. So I will take 5% of that compassion, that evoked compassion, and I will drink that in as good medicine. But what I want to say to people is use the other 95% of your evoked compassion to soothe your own suffering, and then to bring that into your families and into your communities at large. And that was the stream, and that's what's catalyzing a lot of people coming into creating this healing coalition. People are activated and it's not because of me, it's because they're awakened in their heart space. So when I shared this, in Alex, he felt it in a different place. And he agreed, and not only did he agree to actually found the teen chapter, he agreed to let my son, Dylan, be the founding chair of the chapter. And so here's the announcement on day 13. And then what happens, and this gets me into the third dimension of my spiritual awakening. Then what happens is I get the call. So I'm about to they've got the final path back. And I am terrified that it's a grade 4 glioblastoma. That's the worst case scenario. And then I go in, and indeed that's the diagnosis. So my worst case scenario is realized. And then I come back home, and my boys are waiting for me, Zach and Bill. And Zach in 2013, we wrote a book called The Big Decision, where we were on stage together at Conscious Capitalism. So he's been a part of this ecosystem as well. They were waiting for me, and they just took one look at our faces with our shell shock. And they were like, oh, we went into a family grief response. Now, what I understood is that we were running these active learning cycles, and I was looking for, kind of, what is it that would give me some soothing? So we were running these mini, kind of breathing with heart compassion. We tried those experiments. Somewhat what worked, it was saying it is what it is. So opening to a doorway. None of that worked for Dylan. He was pacing. He was in a very agitated state. And finally, he grabbed his phone. He said, I'm going to go up and shoot a video. And this was the video he shot. And it's a video he shot that evening on day 13, when your parent has terminal cancer. And there's a thumbnail over here that says, don't walk out on your movie. Because how he starts, he starts this sharing about thinking about committing suicide, that he was in deep pain. He was in deep pain. He says, I don't know if I can survive this. But then he miraculously finds a metaphor that just dropped in from another world. He said, like, he doesn't know where this metaphor dropped in. He says, maybe this is a movie. And then he points up, maybe this is a movie, and I'm in the worst place in the movie right now. And he says, I have no control over the movie. And he says the movie is being directed by essentially he's pointed to God in the sky. He's saying, I have no control over how this movie ends. But then he pivots and he says, but what if the movie gets better? What if the movie gets better and I wasn't here for that part? And then he pivots. He says, my dad, he uses the Rotten Tomatoes. He says, we're at 0% Rotten Tomatoes. Because my dad makes movies that are 100% Rotten Tomatoes. What if I get to a 60% Rotten Tomatoes and I check out too early? Now, here's what I understood is, first of all, in the morning, when Alexander agreed to let him serve as the founding chair of the teen chapter of Conscious Capitalism, that was in title only. But then through his grief response, by the end of the day, he was embodying conscious leadership as a teen. He was the embodiment of conscious leadership, because I'm thinking, how many lives did he just save by other teenagers who are on the brink, by encouraging them not to step out of their movie?
Beautiful.
So then I understood that there's a third part of this, that there's a third part of my awakening. I understood then that if I had had a milder diagnosis, we would not have gone through that grief response. So I understood that I'm called to have the worst case diagnosis, to serve. So I am called to have this diagnosis, and I am full. My third dimension is not only a mindfulness dimension, it's not only a heart space, it's the full spiritual surrender of being now in servant leadership.
Mm. Mm.
And I feel I give myself over to this process, and because of it, I'm experiencing the most extraordinary synchronicities in my life. I'm so blessed. When you open your space to the world of spiritual surrender, there is a kaleidoscope of synchronicities that tend to arrive. And what that leaves me with a deep, deep, deep experience is, Einstein says the biggest question we can ask ourselves is, do we fundamentally live in a friendly or hostile universe? Do we fundamentally live in a friendly or hostile universe? I know in my bones we live in a friendly universe now. We live in the field of compassionate, loving energy, compassionate, loving, conscious energy. And because of that experience, and when we get stressed out, there's a corruption of that energy. So I've answered that question. Do we fundamentally live? I know that in my bones. I know that in my bones. And here's what I get from knowing that in my bones. What's dying in me is the fear of death itself. So I'm being born into a full flourishing of life, and not only physical death, psychological death. The psychological death of not feeling good enough. The living invalidation of that, because some people actually find more terror in that, and they will escape the fear of living invalidation, of living death, to prioritize the comfort of physical death in suicide, sadly. So I am in an embrace. I am aware of my current embrace in this field of conscious loving energy. And whatever I am ready to let my flesh melt off my bones at any time and experience the wonder of what consciousness transformed could look like as I meld more fully into this field of conscious loving presence.
That's amazing, 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 Dan, to hear you describe it that way, and it reminds me of the many levels and depths that go with leadership and personal development. And, we started at the beginning of this as sort of talking about, what are some of those tools for managing reactivity? And, at some level, that's really important. It's really important that we become self-aware around how do I manage and be aware of reactivity and shift into creativity. And then there's a whole other level, which is also going much deeper in this journey of self-discovery and connection to our hearts, and then ultimately in a connection to something bigger than ourselves. And I'm so sad and sorry that's what it took to get you to that place, but I'm so happy for you that you're in that place.
Well, Danny, thank you for that. I think what you're doing is helping us emerge from kind of this trance. I think people, we live our lives sort of asleep in many ways. And when I heard the news about your diagnosis, I think right that night or maybe the next night, I had this really clear vision. And the vision was, the message was, you're dying. Now live like it.
Yes.
Right. And if you really think about it, you said, when you stepped through that door that you had infinite time here and you had finite. But the fact is, the minute you're born, you're looking at about 26,000 days in a life, average human life. And if you look at where we are at our stage of life, I'm probably looking at another 7,000, if indeed it goes, to that degree. So it's always very finite. The amount of time is incredibly finite, but carries within it infinite potential.
Yes.
Right? It's incredible what you can do in a day. It's incredible what you can do in 90 minutes even. I find, Viktor Frankl wrote Man's Search for Meaning in 3 weeks, right?
Oh, wow.
Impacted tens of millions, over time. So I think this awakening, you're basically awakening people, pulling people out of their trance, and saying, recognize this precious gift of life, and it's only with you for a limited amount of time, within which you have incredible potential. And the trick is, it's one thing to awaken, it's another thing to stay awake. Right? And I think what you're saying is we need to just stay awake every moment. And then I love the way you phrase it, stay awake to what really matters, right? It's that, as you said, the intense giving and receiving of love. And so I think it's just, you're channeling on behalf of all of us some incredible wisdom, loving wisdom that I've experienced you over the years. I've never experienced you more powerful than you are right this minute. It is incredible, and there's so much more to come out of that, and recognizing that which is scarce does become precious. And the fact is, none of us have infinite time. We have limited amount of time, and we have to recognize and treat it as precious, and utilize it to its potential, which is extraordinary. What human beings can create within even limited amounts of time, the amount of beauty and the amount of love and the amount of transformation and change that is possible is extraordinary. So I think you've really awakened. I know you've awakened us, but everybody, I think, that is in your orbit is being transformed by this. Well, that's the biggest gift that anybody, you talk about finding meaning in suffering, as Viktor Frankl talked about. The only way to make meaning out of that is to reduce suffering in others and bring more joy for others because of what you're going through. Well, you're doing that in spades. So we're just incredibly grateful and kind of in awe right now, of you and your family. And that there's a nobility to what's happening here. That's such an object lesson, for all of us.
Well, Raj, can I pay you a tribute? Because I think for many people in this movement, you represent the heart of the movement, the heart and wisdom of the movement. And so when I met you, as awe-inspired as you're expressing yourself right now, I was, from the get-go, you were a leading light for me in the organization. You inspired me, and I wanted to emulate you. And so, where do you feel you draw your deepest wisdom? How did you come to be this way?
Well, that's a whole other conversation. If you look behind me, it says Awaken Inc., right? Awaken is the name of the book.
Yeah.
I'm working on my own life story and making sense of it. And I think the many factors that shape all of us, and I happen to come from a background which embodied the extremes of compassion and unconditional love and caring on the one hand, and the extremes of misogyny and abuse and all of that on the other side. Sort of the toxic, misogynistic, abusive, hyper-patriarchal masculine energy that was embodied in this feudal culture that I come from, and in my grandfather and father and so forth. And the pure and innocent and unconditional love and care that my mother embodied. And like many from my culture and many around the world, really, we end up spending most of our lives trying to impress our fathers, or trying to be worthy of our fathers, or trying to follow in those footsteps, because they're out in the world doing conquering and winning and trying to do all of that. But at some point, I think it was actually while I was writing Forms of Endearment, a specific moment when I was moved to tears with some of those stories. And I felt that I had found my bliss in Joseph Campbell's language, and that was really what resonated, and that's really what lit me up as a human. That this was my journey now. That was the purpose kind of landed on me. It found me, like a butterfly lands on you if you're still. And then it was a couple of years ago when I turned 60 that a coach just looked at the whole picture, zoomed out from it, and said, "Do you realize that you have been honoring your mother with your work for the last 15 years, starting with Forms of Endearment, 2005, and that before that you spent 45 years trying to impress your father? That was a that was a losing cause. It would never work. That was ill-fated to begin with. But then you found your true path, which was to bring. So what's missing in the world is really, what you talk about loving, right? The mother energy, the life-giving, life-enhancing, unconditional, caring love. My father's love was entirely conditional. Do what I say, and then you're in my good books. If not, you're dead to me. And that's all too common, I think, out there in the world. So I think it's really bringing that energy. And once she gave me that realization, which is I believe in the coaching so strongly, because I think coaches can change your life, with simple insights. That allowed me then to not only recognize that, but to really lean into it and live into it, and not be hesitant to express that in various ways. And then, of course, as I go through this book and my reflections, it is not about a wholesale rejection of the masculine. It's about really, as you said, wholeness. It's about saying, what is the beauty, and the love and all of that exists on that side and on the feminine side. And how do we integrate the best of those two things? That's what it means to be human, right? To be strong and loving, right? To be, firm and compassionate, to have justice and mercy, and all of those things together. So that's really, and I think that part of my journey is still unfolding. I found the sort of the mother side of things, but now recognizing my father's gifts and what I have received from him, or I can receive, I think that's the next part of it, to get to real wholeness.
So there, it sounds like, you've transformed your adversity into glorious learning. It's it comes back to the active learning cycle, and we've all had an experience of adversity, and the question is, does that experience of adversity pluck you out of your active learning cycle or lean you into your active learning cycle? And I think what I'm hearing, Raj, is that you've embraced through your own journey, and perhaps facilitated by coaching, a leaning into the reflection of that. And there is a deepening into each one of these areas. So what happens is the purpose frames the content or experiences we want to have, and then that deepens you into a curation of content or experience, and then there is reflection. There's an attitude of reflection, which is ownership, openness, kindness, curiosity, presence, and always coming back to purpose. And then there's a form of the generative question, and that leads to inspired action and puts you back into that cycle. So what it strikes me is that this journey that we've all been on together, and Timothy, I'm sure you've had your own story as well when you look at your evolution. And so what I find powerful is that for us to know, are we on the right track in our learning? What's the signature of that? So essentially what we're running is micro experiments. You're running micro experiments and you're looking for the signature of energetic contraction or energetic expansion. So when you think about your dad, that puts you into a world of energetic contraction. When you think about your mom, that puts you into a world of energetic expansion. And now when you're thinking about the integration of both, I'm hearing also a more stable, you're actually integrating both to create a stability to understand that they both have a role to play. It's not an either or, it's a both and. Mm-hmm. So it's following those breadcrumbs in micro experiments for ongoing learning and development and transformation. And then what we get to do by putting it in this active learning cycle is we get to break it down into smaller parts. Because what happens is ultimately we want to go into big chunks of transformation. And I think that at times is overly limiting. So as we're doing our work in the stream of purpose and engaging in reflection, allowing yourself to take, what's the smallest step I can take right now? What is the smallest step I could take right now? Where I could get feedback from the field of compassionate, loving presence to give me a clue, am I in the field of energetic expansion or contraction? So you put yourself into a much more intimate relationship with the field of conscious, loving presence.
Wow. Wow, Dan, that is a beautiful way of expressing it in a practical terms, in terms of, we want our leaders, we want us all as human beings to be living from this place and learning to love well, to learning to live a life of love.
Yeah.
And opening that heart to this possibility that life can be so much more. And I love the way you framed it. I just love the way you framed it. And when you frame it the way you do, it seems almost, it's so compelling. It's almost like blindingly obvious. like what's the alternative? Like once you've heard this or been exposed to it, like what's the alternative? I want to be closed down. I want to be living at the surface of my life. So it's so beautiful for you to be such a living example of that experience and being able to share that there is this possibility of living from this space.
Well,
and this is deeply human.
Well, I also want to give credit to, this is channeling through me. This is coming from the field. And the reason we're all resonating with this, the reason why you're so inspired, in what you're expressing, is not because of my genius, but because we're expressing a universal genius that expands beyond all of us. We all have access. We all have access to this field of wisdom. This field of wisdom. It's not, and I think part of what the corruption is we all want to claim an ownership stake in the field. We want to claim that genius for ourselves without giving it over to the universal genius. So I am in full spiritual surrender. I don't want to claim any of this as my own. And I want to acknowledge that when you resonate with that, you're resonating with that, not because of my genius, but because you're resonating with the same field.
There's a quote I came across from Russell Brand. Do you know Russell Brand, the actor and comedian?
Yes, yes.
And that guy, he's really brilliant. I mean, and he channels this kind of wisdom frequently. So I just want to read this. Why are our systems not more representative of the divine, purer truth that we can access through spirituality? An infinite world made out of love and understanding. That level of consciousness exists. Our systems, athletic, entertainment, economic, political, and social, should be as close as possible to that feeling. Isn't it odd that we are able to experience this sense of oneness, this love that seems to transcend our personal form and everything we believe in? And yet, when it comes to our systems for organizing this plane that we live on, this material plane, the choices we make are not about that love and understanding. They're about resources and elitism and our monkey need for survival.
Yes, yes. Oh, that is glorious. And that's,
That's so well put, it's like
about staying awake, stay awake to that, that higher level, right? Don't fall back into the trance.
So that's when I unpack my live a loving life. There's a lot to unpack in that phrase, because it begins with a living reverence for life itself. Live a loving life begins with a reverence for this compassionate, loving presence. And whatever word you use for this, some people use the word God. Some people use the word Indira's net. We in our family, I actually call it the field. My wife calls it the force. So together we call it the force field. And because our family, we said force field, well, it's the force field of miracles, and our children were born into that force field of miracles. So whatever word you use for that, the more love you shower, the more love and reverence you shower into that, the more you get back. So that's living a loving life includes that dimension, massive dimension. And I think what we're doing over here is we're paying collective reverence that this is not ours. This is a credit to this field. And then from that place, we actually are more liberated to engage in the free-flowing receiving and giving love with others, and loving life itself fully. And it's I'm just swimming in these waters is delicious. I've never been this contented and happy. I've never been this contented and happy. And it's not in spite of my cancer, it's because of my cancer.
Beautiful. Thank you, Danny, for our time together. And thank you for what you are sharing and giving to all of us through this journey. We feel like we're on the journey with you, and continuing to hope and pray for as much time as you will be granted, and we can all be granted for your presence here. Yeah. So thank you again for joining us, and I think this was a really special episode for us.
Yeah, well, I want to just close with just love and appreciation, with deep love and appreciation for both of you. You have been a major influence in my life, in the journey of my life. In many ways, I am primed for this moment because of what's preceded it. And you're a big part of the story of what's preceded this. You've given me the context to have this transformation. I want to thank you for that from the depth of my heart. And then I want to also just thank you all for listening, and I hope we've served you well in living a loving life.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you. Living a loving life in the face of death has been incredibly and truly inspiring. And thank you. And thank you to our listeners. For those of you that are listening on whatever channel you happen to be on, please feel free to hit the subscription button. And if you feel so moved, go to iTunes and give us a score and leave us a comment. Or you can leave us a comment at theconsciouscapitalists.com. And if you want to learn more about conscious capitalism, there's always our book, The Conscious Capitalism Field Guide. And Raj, where else can people learn more about conscious capitalism?
You can go to consciouscapitalism.org and learn about the movement, the principles, the chapters that we have all around the world, as well as the new teen chapter and all the other exciting things that are happening. So do join this movement and become part of impacting the world in a positive way through business.
And Danny, if people want to know more about the work you're doing, you've obviously given us the link to the video series that you're putting together. How else can they find out more about the wonderful and inspiring work you're doing?
Well, thank you for that. And so you can go to supersmarthealth.com. You can also go to do a Google search on Living Well From Within, the YouTube channel, and then look at the playlist and subscribe there as well.
Again, thank you, Danny. Been so inspiring. And we wish you all of the best. Love, peace, and healing to you and your family.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh.